This narration from the CMGPD training guide will explain the key differences between the CMGPD Shuangcheng and the CMGPD Liaoning. The CMGPD Shuangcheng consists of longitudinal individual, household, and community information on the demographic and socioeconomic characteristics of a migrant population living in Shuangcheng from 1866 to 1912. This migrant population that's actually in the registers are the descendants of settlers that arrived in the region in the first half of the 19th century. The state, for a variety of reasons, organized a settlement of the area both by rural migrants from elsewhere in the northeast, elsewhere in Jilin, and then also from urban Beijing. There's a lot of details that are sort of discussed in the user guide about that settlement, and then our collaborator Chen Shuang has been working on the history of the area extensively, and you may want to look at her publications if you want more details about the sort of process that underlay that resettlement. So by the time the registration, the available registers started in 1866, there were, broadly speaking, three categories of bannermen in Shuangcheng. Metropolitan Jingqi. These were people who had been, or their ancestors had been living in Beijing and nearby in the very beginning of the 19th century, who took part in this state organized effort to sort of relocate at least some of these urban bannermen to Shuangcheng in Heilongjiang. Then there were also the Tunding. These are farmers that were relocated from elsewhere in northeast China, actually a little bit, roughly around the same time, actually a little bit earlier than the Jingqi. They were relocated there with the idea that because they already had experience farming in northeast China, that they would help open up the land and prepare it for the eventual arrival of the urban bannermen, the Jingqi. And then there were other registers covering what were referred to as the Fuding, the floating migrants or unofficial migrants, who mainly came from elsewhere in northeast China without explicit permission, but who again eventually were recorded in these registers. So the CMGPD Shuangcheng is different in a number of key respects from the CMGPD-LN, Liaoning, and I just want to run through those key differences right here. One is that the CMGPD-SC populations were part of the regular banner garrison system, Bachi Zhufang, but the CMGPD-LN populations were under the Imperial Household Department. They were banner populations, but they were under the Neiwufu. That's a fairly technical point, maybe primarily of interest to sort of historians, but it's important to make that point. The CMGPD Shuangcheng is annual, whereas the CMGPD Liaoning is triennial, so you get better resolution in Shuangcheng on certain demographic events, especially exits, deaths, and so forth. The CMGPD Shuangcheng has more complete records of daughters than the CMGPD Liaoning. It's absolutely not complete, but you know, if you look at the sex ratios of registered births in Shuangcheng, they are less skewed than the ones in Liaoning. One of the interesting features of the CMGP Shuangcheng is that there were salient differences in the social origins of the sort of three constituent administrative populations, the urban bannerman, rural bannerman, and the floating population. There were differences in their social origins and entitlements that were based on their sort of hereditary membership in these categories. the state actively tried to preserve differences between these categories through a variety of measures. And so if you're interested in sort of inequality that's generated by institutional context or administrative context, this is quite interesting. Basically, the state wanted to preserve the urban bannermen, the Jingqi as a sort of the elite within this population, and then the rural bannermen, the Tunding, as a sort of support population. Obviously, things didn't quite work out the way that the state planned, and Chen Shuang has written a great deal about this. One of the really striking features about the CMGPD-SC Shuangcheng is that there are longitudinal information on property that are available in the form of individual landholding at regular intervals. This data is being cleaned as of May 2014. We anticipate it being released along with everything else later in 2014. So there's opportunities to study land wealth inequality. The CMGPD Shuangcheng also explicitly records ethnic identification, Han, Man, Mongol, as well as some others. There are some occasions when an ethnic identification is recorded or is sort of implicit in some of the Liaoning registers, but nowhere at this level like we see in the CMGPD Shuangcheng. In principle, because the geographic location is known fairly clearly and we have a high density of the sort of populations within Shuangcheng listed in the registers, there should be possibilities for linkage to Republican era and later data, and as well as because the county archives are relatively rich with legal cases and other materials, there's possibilities for linkage to sort of qualitative sources and so forth. Another distinct feature of the CMGPD Shuangcheng is that the population is densely concentrated in a single county, Shuangcheng, rather than scattered over a sort of fairly large region like it is with the CMGPD Liaoning. So you have a sort of fairly complete record of the population of a very well-defined geographic region, in contrast with the CMGPD-LN, which is obviously spread over a much larger area, and in any one of the areas covered by the CMGPD-LN, there's probably a relatively smaller portion of the population that's actually represented in the registers. One advantage of the fact that the population is concentrated in a single county is that it has made it much easier to physically locate the communities in which people lived. So the CMGPD-SC comes from Qing population registers. There were 260 coded and linked registers from 1866 to 1913. The metropolitan and rural bannermen, these registers were annual, and then the floating population were triennial. And in fact, what's striking about the metropolitan and rural series is that they are much more, in many cases, complete than the sort of various Liaoning series. So we have many fewer missing registers. In total, we have about 1.3 million observations for about 8,000 linked individuals. And we have land registers from 1870, 1876, 1882, 1887, 1889, and 1906. Something like 19,000 cultivated plots. This is a summary of the information that's available in the CMGPD-LN, the sort of first year of every register series, and the last year, total number of registers, and so forth. So certainly all of the metropolitan and rural bannermen, almost all of them begin in 1866, except for the plain white, which begins in 1868. Just means that 1866 and 67 are missing. And in most cases, we again have the registers on a nearly annual, but not totally annual basis, all the way up till 1910 to 1913, depending on which population we're looking at. The bordered blue ends in 1909. And there, again, a total of 189 registers. And then the floating bannerman every 3 years. Again, may talk about this later. The registers for the floating bannerman, the data quality are not as good. They're triennial. There's other problems with the data. So exercise caution when examining the floating bannerman. This is a summary of the number of observations available for each year in the CMGPD Shuangcheng. As you can see, it bounces around a bit depending on where we have especially clusters of missing or surviving registers. The probably most missing registers are 1905, 1904, 1903. So we have an unusually large number of missing data for 1902. One other thing to note is that this is very different from the Liaoning registers in the pattern of missing, in that Liaoning we have no registers at all from 1888 up to 1903. Here, obviously, we do have registers during that time period. The Jingqi, that is datasets 101, 102, the plain and bordered yellow banners, were descended from urban residents who were relocated from Beijing in the early and sort of to some extent middle, but mainly early 19th century. The state wanted to establish them as a elite within this region. They had the most generous land allocations and various other sorts of preferential treatment. They were relocated from Beijing over an extended period of time. It was a sort of fairly long process by which the state wanted to reduce its expenditures supporting the sort of banner populations in Beijing and make them productive farmers. The state put a lot of effort into trying to incentivize at least some of the urban banner families to relocate to the region. Not as many people volunteered to relocate as the state had hoped, but there were, again, some, and these made up the Jingqi population, that is datasets 101 and 102. As I mentioned, the Tunding were the descendants of farmers that were relocated from elsewhere in northeast China in advance of the arrival of the Jingqi. The Jingqi came later. The idea was that the Tunding, mentioned earlier, were supposed to sort of go there earlier, help clear the land, start farming, build houses and so forth, basically prepare the way for the Jingqi. And then once the Jingqi arrived, turn things over to them. And so they had land allocations, but they were not as generous as the ones for the Jingqi. And they had some other restrictions. Again, the Fuding were other migrants who came in on their own. The state tried to sort of maintain status differences between these populations with various sorts of restrictions on land transfers and so forth, with mixed success. But it's a great opportunity to compare populations both according to their origins. We have a urban origin and a rural origin population. And then we can also look at sort of institutional context as well. This map summarizes the origins of the settlers in Shuangcheng. So the the Jingqi, the urban bannermen, mainly from Beijing and Rehe, and then the rural Bannermen were primarily from these communities in what is now Liaoning, and also what is now Jilin or Heilongjiang province. So people, from the further south, from Jinzhou, Fuzhou, Xiangyue, and so forth, and then in some cases people coming from closer by, like Wula or Jilin, Bodunay, and so forth. This is a map of sort of Shuangcheng as it was laid out. It was a planned community, so to speak, or a set of, master planned set of communities, where the urban Bannermen, the Jingqi, were intended to reside in the central area. And actually the other, the plain red, plain yellow were on the left in that central area, large solid circular dots. Plain white bordered yellow were on the right in the squares, and then some of the other banners, blue, white, red, and blue, were sort of laid out a little bit further away. The central office, the yamen, was in between the left and the right, and then there were sort of subsidiary offices, the east and west yamen off to the west and the east. And just by looking at the map, you get some sense for the scale. So this was it's actually not far from what is now Harbin, and it was again a fairly self-contained population. These are examples of some of the register pages from Shuangcheng. You may notice that they look very different from the samples from Liaoning. So a typical register page would specify the banner affiliation, name of a village, actually the place of origin for the residents, their ethnicity, surname, occupations, relationships to household head, and so forth. And then the second page is just more sort of examples. Again, you have, or another example, and so you have information about father's occupation status, grandfather's occupation and status, that's for the household head, and then the records of family members. Some other aspects are similar to Liaoning. There are vital events recorded indicating that something has happened within the last year, and so forth. These are examples of some of the landholding pages that are linked to the household registers. So basically, they're organized by village, and then there'll be a list of landowners from within the village, and then for each column, something about the name of the owner, the type of land. There are different administrative categories, the land size, and then some qualitative description of the location. So, broadly speaking, the sorts of information that are available in the CMGPD-SC are similar to that which is available in the CMGPD Liaoning. Demographic characteristics such as age, sex, marital status, ethnicity at the household level, and official position, landholding, which is very different, of course, from the CMGPD-LN. Events, demographic events are similar. Exits are recorded as annotations, just like in the CMGPD-LN. Deaths, outmigration, outmarriage, and so forth. Attainment of position is inferred by sort of changes in status from one register to the next. Migration is inferred from changes in the address. There are household characteristics, relationship to the household head, and so forth. Generally, households are simpler than in the CMGPD-LN. People, this was a more recently arrived population. People came as households and actually not as part of large kin groups. So the society in some ways is much more atomized than the Liaoning society. where the Liaoning registers record a population that had actually already been settled there for some time before the registration began. So there had been time for extinction on the one hand, and then growth of other descent lines. So basically, time for the population to become increasingly concentrated into specific surviving descent groups. Again, in Shuangcheng, it was a much more sort of atomized and much more recent migration of households, so we don't have as many sort of large descent groups as we do in Liaoning. So it would be harder to study these sort of very large descent lines in Shuangcheng in the same way that we do in Liaoning. For these reasons, the kin networks that we can reconstruct in Shuangcheng are generally not as complex as in CMGPD-LN, because the population is much more closer to its founding, and the founders tended to come as sort of individual households, not as entire collections of households. And then we have the social origins of various sorts, including Jingqi and Tunding, Fuding, and then we have the locations from which they migrated, and then their ethnicity. This is just an example of the multi-generational linkage in CMGPD Shuangcheng. So again, in almost all cases, we can link people to their fathers. Toward the beginning of the 20th century, we can link almost everybody to their grandfathers. But we have smaller percentages than in Liaoning of people that we can link to great-grandfathers or great-great-grandfathers. There's been several published papers on the CMGPD-SC, or Chen Shuang wrote her dissertation. That's available from University Microfilms International, or ProQuest. Chen Shuang, we've published a paper back in 2010 in History of the Family, making use of some of the wealth data and looking at relationships between wealth stratification and fertility. Back in 2005, we had a paper on mortality differences in a very early version of the data set. And then there's a paper lead authored by Ren Yuxue, which is more of a institutional history. So there's still a lot of work to be done on Shuangcheng.